important, etc. Why is it important in the context of governance and transformation is a key question that we'll be unraveling through as we go along in this paper. But let me start off by saying that the literature on democratic developmental states is largely silent on gender, and that it is only in recent years that we've got some of the works coming out. And here what I have in mind is the work of, maybe I get the pronunciation not right, I may not get it quite right, but she's called Babazi, N-B-A-B-A-Z-I, Babazi and Mukudi, who actually look at gender and developmental states, so the case of Botswana and Uganda. And my own paper, which is entitled, not this paper that I'm presenting, but the paper where I begin to look at the debates on developmental states, is a paper that was published in the International Journal of African Renaissance, which is called the African Renaissance, the Need for Gender-Inclusive Democratic Developmental States. That's where I started beginning, and then I continued with that debate in the book on governance, gender, and politics. But the work of Mukudi and Babazi is very interesting, and they ask broad questions such as, what are the benefits of developmental states to women? And then they go on to ask, are the benefits of developmental states gendered? Is there more gender equality and more women able to access political and economic opportunities? They ask these broad questions, but they do not seem to interrogate the extent to which governance itself is gendered, thus resulting in skewed distribution of entitlements and perpetuating diverse forms of inequality. This is my criticism of them, in the sense that whilst they are engaging in the literature, it is more like a descriptive kind of interrogation, asking the normal, usual questions, but not plugging into the governance debates. And this is where the difference lies in relation to that literature. And therefore, I argue that Africa needs to develop and consolidate GIDS, the Gender Inclusive Democratic Developmental States, so that governance and transformation becomes more meaningful, so that the masses can then benefit from the enhanced socio-economic conditions that often result from such governance. In other words, what I'm saying is that the application of gender lenses to governance can help us to appreciate the interplay between the private and the public sphere better, and can also help to more easily understand the inherent male biases in policy making and assist in dismantling them. Now, if you remember, I said to you that the 3 lectures that I have in the course of this institute should be seen as a one big whole, and we sort of separated them into different parts, because many of the arguments that we are making are related to issues that we've been discussing and putting forward to you since the first day. So, it is interesting to see that I'm basically saying, well, transformation can only take place, and transformation, let's remind ourselves that when we talk about transformation, it can be social, it can be economic, it can be cultural, it can be political, because transformation can be of these diverse kinds. But when you talk about the broad transformation, it should be like a systemic approach to transformation, whereby it encompasses the notion of the cultural, the social, the political, and the economic, with special emphasis on the socio-economic conditions of people, which can really make a difference to people's lives. So, we all know that Africa has been going through various transitions, and that democracy is very much in the air. The waves of democratization have been blowing over the continent, we know that. But democracy, I argue, and it is often argued, is a system, I quote, is a system of governance in which rulers are held accountable for their actions in the public realm by citizens, acting indirectly through the competition and cooperation of their elected representatives. Close quotation. Constituting a system of governance for the public realm, democracy seems, in this context, in this particular code, democracy seems not then to be associated with either the private realm of the family or the private domain of the economic market. And yet we know, since day one, that the source of many forms of inequality lies in these very private domains and these private realms. I only bring this in to remind us of this very important debate that we had on the spheres, the private and the public spheres, and how when we look at democracy itself in the context of the latest debates on governance, that notion of democracy itself is not really paying sufficient attention to the articulation between the two spheres, and why therefore I'm actually making a case for the gender-inclusive democratic developmental states. So it now begs the question as to what I mean exactly by gender-inclusive democratic developmental states. I argue that GIDS actually are states where the hands of these very states should be made visible, where there is a strong nexus between economy and society, and where that nexus has been infused with women's interest, with women's voices, with women's perspectives, with women's concerns, with the view of making the society more gender equitable and just. I will be sending you those notes. All three of them will come together to you during the weekend, so you don't need to worry about it. I've reserved this weekend to complete all my notes, put them together so that I can send them to you. So if this is the definition that I choose to give, and this is the way I'm conceptualizing GIDS, then we need to be able to really unpack it further and look at some of the characteristics and features of GIDS. What does it mean? GIDS, I'm also saying, therefore, if we agree with that definition, then GIDS can assist certainly can assist in combating patriarchy and promote gender justice, and in so doing, make development and citizenship more equitable. So what are the characteristics or features of GIDS? I have deliberately unpacked them for you and numbered them so that we can get a sense of what are these. So number one characteristic, I suggest, should be GIDS has this as a feature. First, it is a democratic setup where there is a plurality of voices and a multiplicity of players, inclusive of women's voices, representing different interest groups. That is one first feature or characteristic of GIDS. So a democratic setup with a multiplicity of players, a plurality of voices, but inclusive of women's voices. The second major characteristic of GIDS is that decision-making and policy formulation should be done with gender lenses, and should also not only be done with gender lenses, but we should also emphasize the promotion of the absence of male biases. In other words, we should ensure that we dismantle all the male biases through the use of gender lenses. And of course, the removal and the dismantling of these male biases is not something that can happen overnight. We will be discussing how it can be done as we go in the paper, but it is certainly a second characteristic that we need to think about when we are debating GIDS. The third characteristic of GIDS, I would suggest, is that it has to have this whole business of a minimum critical mass of women present and active in decision-making structures. So a third characteristic will be this minimum critical mass of women. Then fourth is that there should be, within the GIDS sort of arena, the thinking on GIDS and the conceptualization of GIDS, the fourth characteristic is that it should have state capacity, and state interventions should be very significant. And I will elaborate on what I mean on state capacity as I relate this particular conceptualization to the debates, the original debates on developmental state, which was gender blind. We will discuss that in a minute. So basically in this fourth characteristic, I'm basically arguing that the hands of the state are very much needed. And the fifth characteristic is that there should be enough of gender expertise within that platform to ensure the gender equitable resource allocation that we talked about. If you remember, both Professor Salo and myself, Elaine and myself, we have actually sort of argued on the different opportunities that we've been presenting, basically saying to be able to get gender equitable development, if we don't visit and revisit the question of how resources are allocated and you don't bring the question of the gender budgets to the table, well then we will still be relegated backwards. It will take a long time before we actually push forward with the gender equity agenda within the governance debates. So these are the broad characteristics and features, the 5 ones that I mentioned to you in terms of what it is that we mean by gender inclusive democratic developmental states. Let me now then, because this gender inclusive democratic developmental states, this GIDS does not fall from the sky. It originates, it is an extension of the original debates on developmental states themselves. And a lot of the literature that exists on that debate, as I said already, is a little bit not a little bit, it's quite gender blind. So, let me take the opportunity to welcome Professor Carlos, our research director at GIDS, because I don't think we've met Professor Carlos, he just stepped in. Welcome, Carlos. It's good to have you with us.
Good morning. Good morning.
Sorry we interrupted that.
Sorry to interrupt
No,
you.
no, 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 you didn't. I'm sorry. I'm apologizing to them. So what we're trying to assess is whether such states can actually make a difference, and then ask, there is a major question that needs to be asked, is that, okay, if we are assuming that, not assuming, but if these are the characteristics, but we are assuming that GIDS can make a difference, then we should also couple it with the question as to whether there is space for the emergence of such states in contemporary Africa. And can Africa, which is caught in the throes of globalization, where neoliberalism has been espoused by most parties concerned, whether we can actually create some kind, carve a niche area for that kind of states to be sort of emerging and to be consolidated. It's a question that we should keep at the back of our mind. And in that context, what are some of the challenges that these pose for governance and transformation? This is also something that we need to keep at the back of our mind. Tandika Kandawire is somebody that perhaps some of you are already familiar with his work. He remarks, he tells us that one remarkable feature of the discourse on the state and development in Africa is the disjuncture between an analytical tradition that insists on the impossibility of developmental states in Africa and a prescriptive literature that presupposes their existence. Now, once he says that, there is this, thinking that needs to go on, because very often we diagnose Africa and we see all the ills and all the woes of Africa, and then we have a kind of a prescriptive approach to what should be done. But whether that prescriptive approach as to what should be done is something that is implementable, whether it can be done given the kinds of context that we are in, is something that we do not sufficiently sort of ponder over. And at the same time, the broader literature on developmental states in Africa, I think it is a subject that most scholars in Africa write about, the African state, everybody writes about the African state, and we get all these adjectives that are very often used to describe the African states, ranging from failed states, weak states, kleptocratic states, neo-patrimonial states, rentier states, crony states, all these kinds of states that are very often described by our scholars. And you then have also now, in addition to all these very negative kind of descriptions from what I've just been telling you, crony, kleptocratic, etc. But now increasingly we find that there is a little bit more attention being paid to African states being seen and perceived as possible developmental states, and there's a little bit more debate and attention being paid to it. And that's interesting that we are beginning to get some people like moving. There is a kind of a shift. Perhaps during the course of the discussion we should try to unpack and try to understand what are some of the dynamics behind that shift. What is it that is pushing people to start, or scholars to start, uncovering some of the thinking on the developmental states and the potentiality of developmental states for Africa. So these debates on developmental states have been largely inspired to some extent by the East Asian miracle. The early success of countries such as Japan, Korea, Taiwan have enjoyed impressive economic growth rates and rapid industrialization during the post-war period. But as we step into the 21st century, we witness the emergence of new economic powers, which we argued the other day. Both Elaine and I were saying that this new configuration of globalization has a new kind of implication on the continent and for the nature of the states and the kind of states that would evolve and the kind of development that they are trying to put into place. And remember that we've been also arguing that neoliberalism is the kind of agenda that most of these states are espousing in the context of the throes of globalization. Some of the most important authors on the debates on developmental states are an economist who is based at Cambridge by the name of Ha-Joon Chang. He's probably one of the greatest authority on developmental states, an economist based at Oxford and sometimes at Cambridge as well, demonstrates how the state played a critical role in this unprecedented process of economic and social transformation. And he explains this, and let me just quote or go on to explain what he says. Ha-Joon Chang actually defines a developmental state as one which seriously considers, and this is very important for us on the continent, because he defines a developmental state as one which seriously considers the objectives of long-term growth and structural change, and which at the same time has the potential to create and regulate the political and economic relationships that are necessary for sustained industrialization. So I think if you pay heed to the definition, it's not like a finished definition. We'll unpack this a little bit further in a minute. But if you pay heed to the first component of this definition put forward by Ha-Joon Chang, you would sort of appreciate the fact that he puts a lot of emphasis on the focus that these countries, particularly the East Asian countries that he was writing, they have this kind of a strategy and a focus as to how to get along and how to focus and to target long-term sustainable growth. How do they do that? What policies do they put into place in order to attain that? And that focus does not change. And all the institutional engineering, the social engineering, the economic engineering that takes place within those countries are actually being driven by those people who can actually focus and ensure that this is the target that they are wanting to get at. Of course, there are many ingredients and there are many reasons as to why they could do it, and that is also something that we can discuss further during the course of the discussions, but it is something well worth bearing in mind. So according to Chang, conflict is inevitable during the process of change, because when you're bringing change and you bring transformation, which is one of the themes of this institute, it is inevitable that we're going to get conflicts. But, he says, political management of the economy helps to mitigate this conflict. Engagement with institutional adaptation and innovation is also required to achieve the overall objectives of growth and structural change. And in addition to Chang, there are many people, including Thandika Kandawire himself, who actually engages with the debate with Ha-Joon Chang. But in addition to Ha-Joon Chang, you have people like Evans, who writes very critically on the notion of developmental states, and it's a document, it's a paper well worth looking at, because actually the title of his paper is Bringing the State Back In, showing us how important it is to bring the state back into the development debates, because very often development on the continent has hijacked the whole notion of the importance of development. And that is why I was saying much earlier on that within the characteristics of the gender inclusive democratic developmental states, the GIDS, it is very important to bear in mind that the visible hands of the state remains perhaps one of the most important characteristics, which is in total sort of disjuncture with what institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are proposing in terms of a rolling back of the state, which has huge implications on the greater feminization of poverty, etc., that is taking place. But we come back to that. So Leftwich, the person who echoes Chang's ideas, tells us that the definition of developmental states is as follows. He argues that developmental states may be defined as states whose politics have concentrated sufficient power, have autonomy and capacity. I think these are three key words. Sufficient power, autonomy and capacity at the center to shape, pursue and encourage the achievement of explicit development objectives, whether by establishing and promoting the conditions and direction of economic growth. Sometimes, when we are using these people to back up an argument or referring to the literature, one can easily get confused, and I don't want that to happen at this stage, because all that Leftwich is basically saying is that the state should have so much power that it is acting autonomously from other different quarters, particularly from the bureaucracy, because most states in Africa and elsewhere has got a very strong bureaucracy which helps to formulate and implement the policies and the key decision making that takes place by government, by the state itself. So he's basically saying for developmental states to be able to work effectively, there should be a kind of an insulation, a kind of an autonomy between the two. But your bureaucracy should be an efficient bureaucracy, should be a strong bureaucracy, so that there is no tampering with that bureaucracy by the leaders, so that that nature of the governance that we're talking about can be a governance which is an effective one, which is accountable, which is transparent, and with that kind of an insulation, you are more sure to be able to get that kind of efficacy and efficiency and transparency and accountability. And then again, other people like Beeson also describes a developmental state and its objectives, very similar into very similar lines, but he puts emphasis as developmental states' objectives as being having a rational plan. You have to have a rational plan. You have to have planning, which is determined to influence the direction and pace of economic development by directly intervening in the development process, rather than relying on the coordinated influence of market forces to allocate economic resources. The words used, the way that these ideas are being packaged are probably a little bit different one from the other. But despite the packaging being a little bit different, the main idea that is coming through is that if we want development and we want transformation, we need to ensure that the state is powerful and that the state is very present and that the state assumes its responsibility whilst preserving the autonomy and the transparency and the accountability. Packaged in different words, but all this with an ultimate goal, with the ultimate goal of delivering development to the people, to the citizens of the different countries. More closer to us, closer to home, apart from Tandika, there is also the scholar by the name of Edikeji, Omado Edikeji, who writes extensively on the developmental states. And I take issues personally with Edikeji because despite all the work that is being increasingly done on the continent and looking at gender issues in Africa, and we have an intellectual history at Kodesha itself, which is promoting the debates on gender and development, yet Edikeji, who writes extensively on the developmental states and studies it and analyzes it, remains totally gender blind. He does not have one word to say on gender and the importance of factoring in gender in that debate. Edikeji also cites Evans, and Edikeji points to the importance of the state forming key alliances with social groups in order to achieve its development goals. He goes one step further. he does provide us with some kind of anchorage with social groups by stating that that link needs to be done between the state itself and key social groups in order to achieve development goals. Once he says that, and it is very interesting that he takes this perspective, the centrality of gender within the social groups is totally omitted and left out. And the argument that I then make is how on earth can we possibly, within a debate where you're bringing the social groups and the nexus between economy and society and the efforts of those who are ruling to be able to bring development, how on earth can you once more just discard or ignore the whole importance and the pertinence of gender in the kind of planning and thinking that it proposes, particularly in the context of the formation of strategic alliances that he talks about. I find that very, very serious. So, this then brings us to the question that, or the argument that if gender lenses are not going to be applied, gender mainstreaming itself, that Elaine talked about extensively and in a very coherent manner, that gender mainstreaming that we are all for, because we do realize, and there is consensus, that gender mainstreaming can make a difference and can bring about transformation, but without the gender lenses in the development debates and in the formulation of policies, in other words, within the governance structures, we will not be able to effectively bring about transformation and development. And I already said and described to you the kinds of transformation that we are talking here, be it cultural, political, social, or economic. So what are some of the mechanisms? Because it is okay to push the idea of the GIDS forward and say that and take issues with the debates on developmental states and refer to its gender insensitivity and its gender blindness. But if we do that without proposing the kinds of mechanisms that can help us to bring forward the emergence and the consolidation of developmental states, we would have lost out. We would not be making much of a difference. So some of the mechanisms that we need to revisit, and probably some new ones that we need to bring forward. First and foremost, I would like to say that it is very important for development thinkers on the continent, particularly us at Codistria. We often have this thematic of research whereby we talk about beyond the impasse, you know, we like rethinking development. So beyond the impasse, rethinking development, if it is going to be on the agenda again and again, that rethinking of development should absolutely and precisely see to it that we stop having a kind of an omission in the debates. And here I would like to quote the work of an African gender feminist economist by the name of Mansa Pra, who notes and explains to what extent the theory and practice of development itself is highly gender blind, where gender is silenced. So if the theory and practice of development itself is gender blind, how then are we going to revisit that theory and practice of development to be able then to infuse the thinking on gender democratic developmental states, the GIDS? So Mansa Pra has this to say. And this was at one of the African Gender Symposium that was organized by Codistria itself. In a paper she argues, the gender silences we experience as individuals and as nationals of different countries of the global community have occurred not because they are simple omissions or slip-ups in development theory and practice, but like the minute spaces found in any hand-woven cloth, the silences constitute an integral part of the fabric of the discourse of development. Those silences, I repeat, constituting an integral part of the fabric of the discourse of development. Now, if the silences that Mansa Pra refers to are not urgently broken, and this is what I'm saying, if these very silences, we agree that they are there, but if we don't urgently break them, it will take a very long time indeed for African women to be offered the kinds of equal opportunities and to utilize their full potential. And in fact, when Evans, who we referred to earlier, is talking about the state, and here we are talking about breaking the gender silences in the praxis and the thinking of development. And yet when we are looking at the work on developmental states and the literature with somebody like Evans, for example, who is saying that, well, many people talking about development over the world and also in Africa are proposing the idea of making states becoming leaner. And it is very important to some people within the governance debates that we need to look at the importance of assessing stateness and making states become leaner. And this is very much part of the neoliberal discourse, that we need to roll back the states, we need to make states lean, we need to make, supposedly in the name of efficiency, you need to make states leaner. So the neoliberal narrative creates the negative atmosphere that presently surrounds any assessment of state capacity. Remember, we were saying that we need to build up our state capacity. We need to make sure that the hands of the state are visible to contribute and deliver development. But whilst we are saying that, in the times that we are espousing the neoliberal discourse and suggesting that we make states leaner, there is no way that we're going to be able to actually push the agenda of making the hands of the state more visible. So we need to steer away, stay clear from this thinking about the importance of making states leaner. But do we as citizens have the capacity to challenge the governance structures to say, hey, look, mates, we don't want you to make states leaner? Because what is happening is actually many of our countries and many of the people who are directing and leading us, our leadership, are actually espousing the neoliberal agenda, and in a very sort of camouflaged manner sometimes, we are finding this increased dose of privatization, liberalization that I was talking about the other day, which is pushing in that direction of making states leaner. And if that is happening and continues to happen without citizens interrogating and bringing and asking and challenging that, well, then the chances for GIDS to operate will become slimmer as well, and for the difference that we are hoping to make will simply not be done. And that is a serious concern to many of us. And this, despite the fact, and these are some of the contradictions that we are living on in the continent, because on the one hand, whilst this is happening on the one hand, we're still finding so many of our states signing up and ratifying all these international conventions that Elaine and myself have been talking about, including Elizabeth Oji, who was with us in the first week, basically saying that, okay, we have all these instruments, you know, all the instruments that we listed out for you. We have CEDAW, the Convention of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We have the Beijing Plan of Action, on the one hand, which is saying, well, let's push the women's agenda, let's do that. And in order to do that, we need to bring the state in and ensure that we're protecting our women, ensuring that we're using their full potential, making space for us to use their potential, and ensuring that we move with the Millennium Development Goals. And yet we are finding that, on the other hand, the policies within the governance structures are making states leaner. So how can we reconcile these two is a question that we pose. Is there possibility for reconcile these two? And that is why I'm arguing that one of the platforms where we can possibly reconcile these two to some extent and ensure that we move forward and not allow the gains made so far to be eroded is actually through GIDS. So what are the mechanisms that we need? Let's look at some of these mechanisms now. So one of the mechanisms that we've just proposed is obviously to revisit the theory and practice of development. But more precisely, some other mechanisms is to actually look at the electoral systems that we have in our different countries and try to see as to how to make them more gender friendly. Now you will see that the literature on electoral systems and gender makes it quite clear, and in fact there has been an enumeration made out of it. They have actually counted the number of electoral systems which are more of a proportional nature as opposed to the first past the post system, and the argument is that all the systems which have got a proportional systems seem to be much more gender friendly and can allow for the entry of women more easily. But of course, it does not only depend on just replacing one by the other. There are other things that go with it, and we can discuss that as well. The question of quotas is also a mechanism, and there is a lot of debate on quotas, but I think there is a kind of a consensus in many parts of Africa that the use of quotas, although some people may regard it as discriminatory, but at the same time it is important to have it as part of the affirmative action, at least temporarily, to address the history of discrimination and disadvantage that women have faced. So if we use that as a mechanism to bring in more women, although it can be perceived as discriminatory by some, we are saying that, well, let's use it as a temporary measure of affirmative action to bring more women in so that we can actually address the history of disadvantage, and then we can leave it out. Once we've been able to get enough women in and it has become part and parcel of the system, we can go back and say, well, we don't want to use quotas anymore as a form of affirmative action, but it is too early to say that and do that. The other mechanism that we have to engage with is to actually break the male domination of political parties themselves, because political parties at the end of the day are the ones who decide and control as to whether more women are going to get in. So unless we look at and visit and discuss and revisit and get civil society and other stakeholders to engage with them to try and break that male domination within the political parties and the way that decisions are made, we will not get very far. So that also can be seen as one of the mechanisms that we can use. I would also like to suggest that we provide strategic alliances, or develop rather strategic alliances between the different stakeholders, particularly civil society groups, women's groups, in order to be able to push for an agenda of gendered governance with a view of transformation and development. Whilst we have many civil society groups and women's movements on the continent, there is certainly not enough of them which is actually lobbying on this question of gendered governance. They are lobbying for bringing more women in, but they are not making the connection between the question of the numeracy, but connecting it with the politics of transformation, with the politics of ideas. They're still on the debate of politics of numbers. So that debate should be moved now from the politics of numbers to the politics of ideas, to the politics of transformation, through the utilization of these civil society groups and the women's movements advocating and lobbying that way. But for them to advocate and lobby that way, we need to look at yet another mechanism, because if you don't provide the kind of gender training and the capacity building that Binta was talking about much earlier on day one, we will not be able to get that focus on the gendered governance. Because as we all agreed, there is extensive gender training going on in the continent. A lot of resources are being put in, but the key issues as to whether that gender training is speaking to the idea of gendered governance and GIDS is yet to be developed and yet to be consolidated. So it seems to me that there is a need for practitioners, for development organizations, for development partners like the UNDP, like IDRC, etc., who do put in a lot of resources on gender training. I think the focus of that gender training should be tailored in such a way that we can then bring in that debate on developmental states and what it means for people on the ground from a gender inclusive perspective. And I would like to suggest that that can be sort of looked upon as one of the mechanisms. And yes, whilst these are some of the mechanisms that we can, and there may be many more, but perhaps these are some of the most important ones, and we can sort of expand and debate some of these as we go on later on. But let me then say that the way that GIDS then is proposed, the way that I'm proposing GIDS to emerge and to be consolidated, can be perceived by some as a mere increase in numbers, because people who do not understand the literature or who have not gone into the pains of being critical enough and engage with it can just say, well, where's the difference? Because the title of this lecture is supposed to be, can women then make a difference? If we are looking at this debate, can they make a difference? So when they look at this, some people out there can say, well, there is nothing new here, because it can be perceived as a debate on just a mere increase in numbers of women in decision making. But I'm wanting to caution, exercise the word of caution, to make the point that what is in fact argued here is, and I want to emphasize that, because without emphasizing that, we run a risk of having this whole debate on GIDS being derailed. And we're going to miss on an excellent opportunity to be able to have a kind of a combination of scholarly work and work on the ground to come into a particular nexus if we don't avoid that kind of thinking and we don't push the agenda and make sure that we say and we emphasize that we are saying yes, we want the numbers, but we are also conscious and sensitive to the fact that in the debate on GIDS, it's not a numbers game only. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. So the bringing more women in, just like Evans talks about bringing the state in, we are saying, let's bring more women in, and although that is not enough, what we need to make that become more of a kind of a condition that can work is that we need then to capacitate these women with the right kinds of skills, the right kinds of attitudes, the right kinds of knowledge and expertise, as well as the political will to make a difference. For instance, let's take some of the debates that we've had in the last 2 weeks so far. We've talked a little bit in Anta's paper, we sort of broached up on the question of parité in Senegal. And people are saying, yes, it's a question of more numbers. So what if the profiles of these women are like maids coming from somewhere, or people who've got absolutely no knowledge of what politics is all about, do not know what all the issues are? But we are saying in the context of the debate on GIDS, that is a risk. When we are fighting for more numbers, the risk is there for that to happen. But in order to sort of address that problematic and that risk, we need then to be able to make sure that we push on and we give the capacity building that is necessary to the women parliamentarians who need it. We identify them, the kinds of low-profile people that we think are not really making or carrying the necessary weight. Let's give them the knowledge, the skills, the expertise, the political will, train them on how to develop that and consolidate that so that the difference that we're seeking on the ground is actually made by them pushing for a kind of a feminist agenda. So why is it then, in short, these gender-inclusive democratic developmental states should assist in making a difference? Some of you may say, well, what difference are we looking for? What is the difference that we are looking for? And what are the issues that remain largely unaddressed on the ground? And this doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that there has been no progress made. I think a lot of progress has been made. Advances have been made on gender equality. But I also say that in the context of the multiplicity of crises that is hitting the continent, with the food crisis, the climate change crisis, the financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, we find when these ripple effects of these crises are playing themselves out on the continent, we are also at the same time getting a growing feminization of poverty, and MDG goal 3, which is supposed to be attained in 2015, instead of progressing, research is already beginning to show to us that it is regressing. And this is where the danger lies, because despite all these efforts being made, those gains can be eroded on the ground, and women's lives can be affected in a negative way. So what are some of the issues that are still yet to be continuously addressed? They are beginning to be addressed, but we found that these problems are still there, very much are there, in different countries, in different parts of the continent. We still have girls missing in certain parts of the continent. We still have the problems of female genital mutilation, which is causing havoc in people's lives. We still have domestic violence. We still have forced marriages. We still have issues of land rights. We still have issues of access and control of resources that we talked about. We still have the question of feminization of poverty, feminization of HIV/AIDS that Elaine talked about extensively. We still have poverty and the whole problems of reproductive rights. So if we still have all these problems, I think it is about high time that we say, well, we need then to really work along the thinking about this GIDS business and how we move forward with that. So as a concluding note, I would like to say that throughout the continent, African women MPs and many other stakeholders have actually striven to create state institutions for the advancement of feminist change as part of a long-term strategy for improving the quality of life for women in these nations. True, I will say that these people have been working for the advancement of feminist change, for a feminist agenda. In other words, and I said that on day one and I'm repeating what we mean by feminist agenda, is simply a more just society. It's not a question of a reversal of hierarchies where women are going to now oppress men. Certainly not that. We would have failed in our responsibility in what we want to achieve in terms of transformation. But rather we are striving for a more just society through the feminist agenda. So instead of demonizing the state, as is often done, demonizing the state as an entity of oppression, women are increasingly moving from resisting the state to using the state. Because we have realized that if we use the state effectively and if we apply the gender lenses to our governance structures, we can use the state to make things happen. In fact, Elizabeth Friedman, another scholar, has estimated that over 90% of countries have some form of state feminism, meaning that at least one national agency for women has cropped up. Women's ministries, departments, and agencies have begun to come on the ground. And I think this is something that Elaine also spoke about extensively when she was talking about the gains obtained through inputs by civil society groups. She was basically suggesting, indicating to us that some of the gains made were like the Department of Women's Rights, the Ministry of Gender Equality, the gender machineries. But there is also another aspect, another component of the literature, and we should not hesitate to say that, and we need to pay heed to that. Whilst it is true that there is an increasing reliance upon the state for the advancement of this feminist agenda that I'm talking about, there is also the need to remember that sometimes we do have more women in, but they play the game of those who are in power. And if they play the game of the males who are in power, despite all these institutions being more gendered, we will not be able then to have the kind of transformation and difference that we are trying to make. So we need to exercise a word of caution there, but that doesn't mean that we should not push along the lines that we are advocating, because that kind of advocacy infused with the feminist agenda, both by scholarly work and by work on the ground, where theory and praxis can come together for the advancement of women on the continent, is something that through this kind of work we will probably be able to do. And that brings us back then to the thematic of the Institute, which is from a politics of representation to a politics of transformation. And basically what I'm concluding at is that we need, through our multiple interventions, not only us, but the multiplicity of stakeholders who are working in the development field, should actually play around and bring to the fore, to the table of discussions, to the negotiating table, in all the structures of governance, bring those gender lenses. But as a concluding note, those gender lenses, and I want to reiterate that, it does not happen automatically. We need to look at all the mechanisms that are proposed. We need to look at all the revisiting that needs to be done in the different layers of our society, so that the work that is being undertaken can actually sort of help us to unshackle the embedded layers of patriarchy that exist in the different sort of layers. because without unshackling that, I think whatever we do, we will not be able to actually make the difference. So yes, women can make a difference, but the task is a tall order. It's a daunting task. It's a task which demands